be looking for Jeff as we go through this panel discussion to sort of give us a user perspective on some of this. You know, Jeff shows a real need to do something different, a technology that might be of value, but it's still early maturity days in some ways, and so there's still a lot of questions out there. So hopefully, we've got some experts here on the panel in Anat Kadiala of Oracle and David Knoller of IBM and Stephen Kim of SAP that can help illuminate this technology a little bit. And I say a little bit because I've talked to all of these gentlemen, and I'm still struggling to understand blockchain. So I'm not going to say that we're going to come out of here with a deep grounding in blockchain, but hopefully we'll understand it a little bit better. So what I've done is I've asked our panelists to provide slides. I've sort of mixed their slides up. Whoever's slide comes up will have the first crack at the topic, but then everybody else on the panel can talk to it as well. So first, I just wanted to explain what the difference is between we hear about Bitcoin and then we hear about blockchain for business applications like supply chain. So how are they different? How are they the same? And Stephen, I think you provided this?
It's a David's slide, but I can take it back. Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So there are a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions or perceptions around the blockchain out there. So one thing I want to make sure is blockchain is an underlying technology of a Bitcoin, but cryptocurrency is not the use cases we are looking into in enterprise applications. So I want to decouple Bitcoin from blockchain. And Bitcoin is one of the cryptocurrencies out there, and there are many other coins coming up. Right now, I believe there are more than 1,500 coins circulating and being traded as of today. So there are a lot, but it's still early days. But that's more of a cryptocurrency. And there are several different things they are doing. Some of them are trying to represent different type of assets that are currently not tradable, and using the Bitcoin or different types of coins, they want to make it happen. So those are happening, but those are more public and more cryptocurrency type of, they are looking for new use cases or new business models that did not exist before. But where we are focusing on in enterprises, blockchain as a technology have a very unique capabilities that didn't exist before, and we are trying to leverage those characteristics and tie those blockchain characteristics with the supply chain and other manufacturing and other applications and build a solution that could not be addressed before. So something like what AmerisourceBergen is doing with blockchain to provide a visibility across all this drug supply chain for that drug. So Jeff gave an example of a drug, and if you have a serial number on that bottle of drug, and if you scan that, you will be able to see the full history of that drug, life cycle of that drug. So where it was manufactured, and who was the distributor, and who was the pharmacy, and who was the logistic providers to return. And when return comes in, Jeff knows whether this is a resellable or this is a fraud. So that's by basically using blockchain, we are giving visibility and traceability into the life cycle of that drug. So that's one use case, but if you apply that to different industries, whether it's semiconductor chips, or whether it's airplane parts, or whether this is spare parts that go into your assets, oil fields, or others, by just scanning that serial number or watermark into that part, you will be able to see the full history of that part or that chip, where it was manufactured originally, or where it was used, or who it was serviced by, things like that. So the promise of blockchain is very great, and we see a lot of different use cases across different industries. And we are trying to get that data from existing systems, and then not every data you have to share, but subset of data that provides enough insight to everyone in that supply chain. So we see a lot of use cases and promising ideas that are evolving in the market. But it's still early days, and we are doing a lot of proof of concept projects with many customers.
Before we move on to the next slide, just one thing I'd like to add is there's a common source of confusion perception around blockchains that they are inefficient, energy hogs, and very slow and such. A lot of that perception actually comes from Bitcoin kind of blockchains, which have this mining concept and such. Enterprise blockchains, like Hyperledger that all three companies support, do not ascribe to those properties, right? These are purpose-built to be efficient and to be workable and useful for the enterprises. So these do not have the concept of mining that needs a lot of energy and such. Bitcoin is based on that kind of concept, so that's another area of decoupling.
Is this on?
I didn't hear you. Go ahead and try again. Maybe we'll pass it down.
Is it not working? I don't think so. Is this working? Okay. Just wanted to add a word about Hyperledger since it was mentioned. Hyperledger is a kind of blockchain, as he just said. It's developed by Linux Foundation, and all of our companies are a member of that, and we're cooperating to develop that. And then all of us build our blockchain offerings on top of that open source technology.
And I wanted to add another thought on the concern about the throughput. I mentioned all the transactional activity that we have, for example. Blockchain isn't a transactional system. It's the result of transactions. So the client I mentioned before, in our case, SAP's tool, is the one that's managing the transactions. So the heavy lifting isn't in blockchain. It's in your client systems, and everyone, as I mentioned earlier, who's involved with blockchain has a client associated to it. So when you break that down that way and you understand blockchain is only storing the results of a transactional activity, then you have a whole different perspective, or should have, about what kind of volume we're talking about and what kind of horsepower you're expecting it to manage.
And now we're going to take an attempt at describing the technology at a high level.
It was off, now it's on.
Now it's on, yeah.
We have a question in the back left.
Sure.
Hi, since we're about to demystify blockchain and remove some misconception, I have another one. If you could, all of you, throw some light. Given the supply chain use case that was just covered, another misconception is that if your number of parties to a networked transaction, right, in a business network, is somewhat reasonable, maybe let's say 5, maybe manufacturer, regulator, customer, maybe 5. Why can't you get away with a distributed database? What is it? What is that punchline? What is that blockchain? I mean, a very secure distributed database, which nobody can tamper with. Why can't you get? What is it that blockchain will bring you on top of that? And what would be the minimum number of participants in a business network where blockchain will not be an overkill? Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah. Good question. The aspect about distributed database is that each of them are centralized places, and the copies or the information in them can be out of sync with each other. Blockchain ensures that all the nodes have the exact same copy, which is non-repudiatable, right? So that way, there's a common truth, agreed upon truth that all of us have access to. And that's where the first benefit of blockchain comes from, right? And your other question was? You had a second question too, right?
Number. He said minimum.
Yeah, I mean, in any networks, right, I think it takes at least 2 nodes to form a network, and thereafter, you can have any number to it. Right?
Okay, let's go ahead and address the technology at a high level.
Oh, just I would like to add to that.
Okay,
Just,
certainly.
So on the number of minimum viable node or customers on that network, my answer is it depends on the use case. So if a use case requires some multiple parties, if you are, for example, if you are tracking drug supply chain from the manufacturer to distributor to pharmacy and back to distributor, that basically everyone in that use case that touches that drug will need to be participant of that blockchain network. But if you are just talking about other use case where they are just sharing the batch numbers in, let's say, food supply chain, the processor or aggregator and manufacturing companies, just amongst them, by sharing that batch number, might provide a lot of insight and solve issues around recalls or returns or improve supply chain efficiencies. So the answer is based on the use case, the number of minimal viable number of participants vary. And another thing is with the business network, SAP has been running business networks like Ariba and Concur that has more than 3 million participants already. But the problem with those business networks, customers are reluctant to share the data, right? Once you put that data in the network, whether through EDI or portal, that data is centralized, and they don't want to share that data without knowing how that data will be analyzed. So there are a lot of sensitivity and reluctance around sharing the data. But with leveraging blockchain, basically you don't have to share all the data, and also it's basically in this case you are sharing only 4 attributes of that data. So you can dictate what data you are sharing, and using that data, also that's not available to everybody in the network. You can securely mask that data or hash that data, and also give a permission to the people who have access to that data. So there are a lot of those additional characteristics you can leverage to make it more secure, and also you are not sharing all the data. So once we propose that, many people are less reluctant to share data, and through that, you are just capturing minimal fingerprint information across the supply chain. But with that, that will benefit every participant in the network. So that hopefully kind of addresses your question.
Yeah, absolutely. May I just have a quick follow-up? I don't want to belabor this too much. Quick follow-up?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is to the Oracle gentleman, right? So I agree with you. I mean, this non-reputable, provenance and finality, all that is fine. But just, I'm looking at the aspect of a cost benefit, right? I mean, if there are only 4 or 5 parties to a transaction, I could still architect a distributed database on the cloud somewhere which has secure access. You know what I mean? I mean, is there that, whereas to go to a blockchain, which has so much infrastructure, so much of a learning curve, is there that chasm, that trade-off? That's what I'm looking for. But if I'm not going to belabor this too much, I understand your point.
Yeah, I'll quickly answer that in 30 seconds. So in the early days of Internet 2, all we had was the basic HTML pages, but that's not the only capability of Internet, right? In a similar way, Internet gave us a capability to seamlessly exchange data, and that led to things like e-commerce and Twitter and Facebook and so many other things that we are all acclimatized to today, right? Even smartphones, such. Similarly, blockchains give us a concept of programmable trust, right? We are still scratching the surface of it. This concept of shared, trusted data source is just the 1.0 use case. But once we get into more advanced concepts like zero-knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption, quadratic voting, prediction market economics, and such, these are all still in academic stages at some level, and they're not yet ready to be commercialized yet. But in very short order, there's so many smart minds working on this that they will be ready to be commercialized, and that's when we'll see the true punch of blockchain. But in the meanwhile, it is important that there are so many other problems that can be solved with the existing capabilities that we already have today, so why not take advantage of this to solve those problems? And in the meanwhile, build that knowledge and start to understand and grok this concept of programmable trust and what it means to companies and to economies.
Just to add to what the other gentlemen have said, for certain use cases, such as the one that Jeff described, one attribute of blockchain that's very important is the idea that it's immutable and an indelible record of what's occurred. That can be very important in situations where you have to provide a history to a regulator like the FDA or the FAA, because the way blockchain works, before a transaction is written to the chain, participants have a chance to participate in endorsement of that transaction, and they validate and agree that it's a valid transaction before it's written. That becomes very useful for things like regulatory agencies that want to see the information. It's also useful for dispute resolution in cases where something's gone wrong and now you want to go back in history and figure out what went wrong where, because it may be a contractual issue.
But I think the point is fair, though, right? Whenever we look at an application where we might use blockchain, you can't help but think, what are the other ways we could do this?
Yeah.
And what are the costs of the other ways that we could do this? And what are the pros and cons of the two? And so, Jeff, I think you're struggling through all that right now, and you're struggling through it in this supply chain.
I am, and another struggle to kind of touch on some of the trust issue is the current regulations that I was talking about dictate specifically that a significant amount of data be shared between trading partners. Blockchain shows that you can get the same result without all of that. But if you're an accountant or if you're even the FDA and you're doing an audit, you're used to having this trail in front of you of everything that occurred. With blockchain, it's easy to see where you are right now, but you have to have the trust that all those other things did in fact occur. And we have to get there or we're going to be stuck with sharing large amounts of data between trading partners. And I think blockchain can show that it's not needed, but it's a trust factor, and that's a key word. You really have to trust it was there.
Well, and let me give you an example of that, right? So let's say we have a supply chain and we're trying to verify that organic food is being sold in a Whole Foods, and the food originates in, well, let's say it originates in, that it's beef, and it originates in Paraguay. The farmer in Paraguay can send some sort of message saying, this is organic beef. It's grass-fed. It's never had any pesticides. But we still have to check that. We have to somehow check that what that farmer is saying is true. So you can have an immutable record of something that's not true. And that's worth keeping in mind. So we're going to go to talking about the technology at a high level. I think this is actually your slide, isn't it, David?
It is, but I think...
But you know what? Let's give you a chance to go first for a change.
All right, fine.
Okay.
Okay. So blockchain, some of the aspects of blockchain that we've actually touched on already. One is that it's a shared ledger. Today, as Jeff was describing, in the supply chain, people maintain their own ledgers, and they exchange information about supply chain events through EDI or some other mechanism. What blockchain does is it eliminates the need for those EDI events where people are telling each other what's happening and communicating supply chain events. Those are moved onto the chain itself, and the ledger is a shared ledger amongst all the participants. So that's point one, and that addresses the sharing problem you're talking about. They all have seamless access to that information through the synchronization mechanisms of blockchain. Second, privacy. The version of blockchain that all of us work with, Hyperledger, is what's called a permissioned blockchain. That's different than Bitcoin, which is an open network, a public network. Anyone can join it. Now, if you want to participate in the proof of work or mining that I think Anant referred to, that's a different matter. You've got to have a pretty large computer for that, for Bitcoin. But the version of blockchain we use is a permission network, which means that it's a secure network. You have to be a member of the community that's using it, and there's security mechanisms to make sure that anybody that connects and does anything with the network are authorized to do that. So it's a gated community. You can also control who can see what within that network. I think someone mentioned channels. Hyperledger has a mechanism called channels, which allow you to divide all of the information into subsets and control who can see each subset of the information. You can also, at the data level, control who can see what kind of transactions. So you have a fair amount of control over who can see what within the shared information. Smart contract, which is also known as chain code, is basically the business logic on top of the blockchain that includes the definition of the assets that are being managed, lots of drugs, and the individual serialized items would be assets that are defined at that layer. And it also controls the rules for what happens as that shipment moves through its life cycle. So that is like the application running on the blockchain network. And you'll have different versions of that for different applications. Finally, consensus, I mentioned that. Participants in the network can participate in consensus, and if they do, they have an opportunity to validate a transaction before it's written to the blockchain, and all of the consenters have to agree that it's a valid transaction before it's written. That's how the business version of blockchain, Hyperledger, works, versus the much more heavyweight proof of work that you might have heard about with Bitcoin.
The consensus piece, you know, that sounds like heavy lifting. You know, you have 3 or 4 people in a supply chain that have to agree on something. It seems like it slows things down.
Yeah, well, it's very fast.
Okay.
I mean, for the Hyperledger, you're able to do that and get transactions written sub-second.
So it's done automatically in the machine as opposed to having people do it.
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah, it's not human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not human consensus. It's algorithmic consensus.
Okay.
And there are about a dozen different algorithms that are well known as to for these consensus that Hyperledger supports.
Right.
And customers can pick and choose which is the best one for their specific context.
So one thing I would like to add to that is there are a lot of technology terms, consensus,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't really bother too much. Blockchain technologies are still in very early days, and there are different types of blockchains out there, and some have a consensus mechanism, others are bypassing consensus to really eliminate that kind of a complex algorithm. So there are many out there, and that's still evolving. And a lot of the blockchain technologies is looking for industry and use cases. If there are real killer use case, they will adapt and really evolve to support their use case. So that's what I see is still technologies are still early days, and it's very flexible to be changed. There is no real just a single blockchain technology that cuts across all industries. But we will, in maybe 5 years from now, we will see some emerging and winning technology. But where we need to focus on as an industry is really, blockchain is not single company driven. It's a ecosystem play, industry play, and also, as Zeb mentioned, really building trust across that participants, and also the driving the standards and the verification of that standard. Things like that is really important. And that's where we see more companies are collaborating together and driving the standards on not only the use cases, but at the blockchain level as well.
We have a question back here.
Hi, Mike Dedzik from ArcelorMittal Dofasco. So the steel business has definite interest in really learning about this technology and how it may interact in our supply chains and that. From everything I've heard so far, though, is it an appropriate time to give some kind of awareness to our leadership level, or should we wait a little bit till this technology gets better? I don't want to confuse them. I mean, they understand that this is coming here, but are we at a point where I could get together like a good kind of view of a business-hardened blockchain that we may need to deal with now? Is that kind of information available, or what is available for us now that makes sense, or should we be waiting?
Before anyone responds, can I ask, are you saying your leadership isn't aware of blockchain yet?
They are aware of
Because
it.
these guys are all over mine.
Yeah. No, we're definitely aware of it there. And we do the EDI with our key customers and all that there. And there's definite interest in this. And especially, when you're looking at our automotive friends, they're very advanced. And we see that down the road, they may want to start looking at this there. And we want to be prepared. But am I at the right time to support my leadership with this? Or is it still a work in progress that maybe I should wait a little bit? Like, what can I say now versus what should I say later?
Yeah, I'll just speak from SAP perspective, what we are doing. We hear those kind of questions a lot from our customers. And what we have done is over the last 2 years, we did multiple pilots and proof of concepts, and we are trying to standardize some blockchain applications as a standard application that works tightly integrated with rest of SAP solutions. So we are in the middle of standardizing some of those applications. And to do that, customer feedback is very critical. So we created a blockchain co-innovation program. And right now we have 52 companies who joined the program. And with those companies, we are doing a lot of workshops. So in this case, AmerisourceBergen is one of 52. And in pharmaceutical, we have other certain pharmaceutical companies that are working together on this. But in different areas like automotive, aerospace, and defense, companies like Daimler, Airbus, they are part of this program. And we are doing a lot of workshops together with those companies. So one is if you join the program, we will be able to share what we are doing across industries with other customers. Or if you are interested in having like a blockchain innovation day at your site, we will be happy to arrange that as well. So yeah, that's what we are doing from SAP perspective. I'll leave it up to others.
Yeah, I've got a comment. So similar to what Stephen said, I guess what I would add is, if I could compare it to car models, we're no longer in year one. A lot of work's been done. Things have been going on for 2-3 years now, and the technology is a lot more mature now than it was at first, and very much more ready for production. We've got a lot of projects that are transitioning from POC pilot into early production phase. So I think the technology is ready. The other comment I would make is that blockchain isn't something that a single company does. There's a business network normally involved, such as what we've been talking about here. And it takes a while, as you could guess, to bring together the participants that will participate in a particular implementation of blockchain and be part of that network. So that's not going to happen overnight. And so I think getting that conversation going amongst participants and running a pilot, getting people on board, that's going to be a little bit of a journey. And so the sooner you begin that, the sooner you're underway and can progress through that and get to the point where you're ready to try something with a group.
Yeah, and I second these two gentlemen as well. At Oracle, we feel we are ready for the customers, and we have been, in fact, working with many customers for a while now. So yeah, the technology is ready for prime time. It has been evolving, and so we're not still in the cutting teeth phase with Hyperledger specifically, right? So like David said, it's not just only a technology play, it's also a business and business operations play, like Jeff said. So it's important to wrap our head around those things and think about the right kind of first use case if you're early in this journey to think about and what business value it benefits, because the future blockchain success in your organization depends upon the success of the first pilot. So.
And I would add, I think it actually is a lot more mature than most people realize. Right. The work that Oracle, IBM, and SAP has done already represents that. What they lack is your involvement. What they lack is more industries coming forward and saying, I want to work together. The option, of course, the alternate, if you will, is you follow whatever others in your industry do, but you have a say. You can help them help you. Technology is technology. What are you going to do with it? They need you to understand that. And I think they've all demonstrated, all three of them, how they're working with those who are willing to step up to find the way to make this newer technology fit. But I think it's a lot more mature than most people think. What's not mature is how are you going to use it?
Let's see here. Trying to advance it, Will, we're having some problems.
Kick it.
Oh, we advanced it too far, I think. Two.
Unplug the laptop, plug it back in.
Well, you know what? Let's just go ahead and do this one. Is this your slide and not?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what we're trying to articulate here is just crystallize the core concepts underlying blockchain because, like we were talking earlier, there's a lot of literature out there, and many times the metaphors are mixed up, and the nuance between permissionless and permission blockchains are mixed up. So it's confusing for someone who's coming new, and it took me a while to wrap my head around this. So I thought I'll crystallize it here. First and foremost, we're talking about a network and information exchange, right? So the peer-to-peer architecture of blockchain is intentionally designed to enable that quick communication and also to make sure that the same exact copy is replicated to everybody, right? And peer-to-peer architectures have been around for a long time. BitTorrent is peer-to-peer, Napster was peer-to-peer, and so on. And blockchain rides on many of these previously existing concepts, and they came up with this interesting concoction, right? So the next one is, how do you establish this concept of trust, right? We understand it at a psychological level, at a colloquial level, but from a computational level, what is trust and how do you establish it, right? So it espouses many different cryptography concepts, mathematics, algorithms, and such. And through a combination of those, blockchains let you, program trust, and also the concept of chain code, which is essentially the business logic, that you write in Hyperledger, and how that can dovetail with your consensus process as well. And all of that together constitutes how trust is achieved in blockchain, right? That itself is a fairly complicated topic, but I'll leave it at this point. Otherwise, we can keep on talking about it. So the next one is the agreements and the business logic, right? So some call it smart contracts. In Hyperledger, we call it chain code. Smart contract is a confusing phrase because when we hear the term contract, we think in terms of legal contracts and such. Yes, blockchains can be used for that too, but when we talk about smart contracts in blockchain, it also is synonymous with business logic. Just like you can write business logic in a stored procedure, you can write business logic in a smart contracts, but there are differences. They're not exactly the same. And we've been talking about consensus. Basically, that's the algorithm that makes sure that all the nodes agree that the data that is about to be written has the right digital signatures, it has the right fingerprinting, and making sure it's coming from the right source, and it has the right business context for writing. That's what the smart contracts or the chain code enable also, right? And then the last one is value. In Hyperledger, we don't really talk about the cryptocurrency aspect of it, but that's definitely a concept of blockchains, and Bitcoin and Ethereum, they take upon those concepts, right? So those are the quick whirlwind concepts underlying blockchain, and as you go deeper, there are much more, but I think for the context of this discussion, I thought this would suffice. Anything else?
That's fine.
Next one, please. Next one.
Yeah, next one.
And David, that's your slide. This sort of sets the stage for the kinds of business problems where it might make sense.
Sure. So these are not hard and fast rules. These are general guidelines that we usually look for to decide whether or not a particular use case is...
The mic, he needs the mic.
Oh, sorry. I guess I have to start over. These are not hard and fast rules. These are general guidelines that we usually look at to decide whether or not something is really a fit for blockchain, or should it be, some other solution, as we were discussing earlier. The first one is the second one on the chart, which is business network. Blockchain is not usually something that you would use within a single company to create, a database where everybody can log on and see what's going on with production or something like that. It's aimed at a business network where you have people participating in something like the supply chain process that Jeff talked about earlier. And it supports controlled collaboration and information sharing amongst the participants in that network. Second is industry impact. Normally it's something that is a problem with scale. Moving a group of participants onto blockchain where today they're using EDI or paper, and I mean, this is kind of a big deal. And that's going to have an impact on something like, for example, the logistics within the pharmaceutical industry. Usually, another thing we look for, by the way, is regulated processes are really a nice fit for blockchain. The example Jeff talked about, and in fact, you could back up from that and go through pharmaceutical manufacturing, which is also regulated. And if you think of it as a digital thread, if the manufacturers are using blockchain to record what happens during production, which is also a regulated process, and then it follows through into the supply chain, you've got real nice history for what's happened with those drugs. And blockchain's a perfect fit for something like that. In other industries, you've got similar requirements and use cases for things like in the aviation industry, for example, the manufacturers have to be able to provide records on things like landing gear and that they've been maintained and what their history is. And so it's a similar use case because you need to be able to track the history of that landing gear, its usage, the maintenance, and be able to share that information amongst the aircraft manufacturer, the maintainer of the landing gear, the FAA in that case, and the operator of the aircraft, the airline. So it's another similar nice use case for blockchain. We've talked quite a bit about the fact that blockchain through consensus and the fact that records are right once. It's considered to be an immutable record, which in the future I think is going to be very valuable, and in fact now in some supply chain processes, very valuable for dispute resolution when things go wrong, as well as trust for the records that are being provided to regulators you as the FDA. So those are in general what we're looking for a blockchain use case. You guys have anything?
Yeah, I'd like to add this
Sure.
because when this first came up, all three of you approached my company, others as well, and I'm like, wait a minute, I don't have a problem I'm trying to solve. Why do I need this technology? Luckily, the January 2015 regulations are already been met, but also luckily we hadn't met some of them that are out in the future. So we were able to step back and look at, well, let's see where this can go to help us there. I have a solution for all of it through 2023. It's ugly. So is there another opportunity? And so I started out with my CIO asking, what problem are we trying to solve? That's our traditional way to approach things in IT. I've now gone back and said, wait a minute, what possibilities can we bring to our business and to our own IT shop with the use of this newer technology? And that's what I had as some additional use cases. That's the exciting piece. Meeting the regulations, we'll meet them with or without blockchain. I would like it with blockchain, but blockchain with as a solution for that will get me wet. It will help me understand more about blockchain so I could be successful in transforming business in other areas. So to me, it's not just the use case, but first, what's the possibility? What can you do better than what you're doing today, even though what you're doing today works?
Yeah, I really like that, and I see that across different companies. When they approach this, they try to solve existing problems, but once they understand, customers understand the possibility of a blockchain, it kind of, they imagine some new business models that did not exist before, so leveraging blockchain, you instead of, for example, selling a product, you can provide a service or solution that cuts across the life cycle of that product and things like that. So many companies are starting to imagine that and come up with new business models that did not exist. And some companies who come up with some of those viable business cases, I think they will use blockchain to advance in their business and then use it as a more competitive advantage across their industry.
Give this another try. Okay, there we go. And Anant, this is yours.
Yeah, I think we've been covering most of this to the discussion, but some of the popular use cases, right, that involve blockchains and supply chains also involve IoT as well, Internet of Things, right? And when we say Internet of Things, it's not just one thing. There are different paradigms within that, depending upon what you're doing. But quickly, we talked about track and trace quite a bit. Jeff went through the pharmaceutical use case, and similar use cases apply in food industry, discrete manufacturing, and pretty much any manufacturing that you can think of, right? Trade finance is another area where it's very interesting because in terms of use cases like invoice factoring and such, banks are looking at using blockchain to simplify the process. And also, there are some new concepts emerging in terms of how might we use other areas of trade finance as well, some new use cases coming up there. Then, bill of lading and customs processing is another big area. If you think about it, we've been trying to do this since the 80s to electronify bill of lading and such. But blockchain gives us new possibilities, to borrow Jeff's term, in terms of solving this problem in a more elegant manner than before. So for that reason, automated bill of lading is becoming important. Also, when you think about new kinds of transportations like drones and self-driving trucks and sidewalk robots and so on, then that also requires this kind of a more reliable electronic way of transferring goods. That means electronic bill of lading would be needed. Then global trade and compliance. This is around making sure that the products don't show up in gray markets and black markets and such. And up until now, companies have dedicated teams and processes around their ERP systems to make sure their orders are processed in a certain way, certain checks and balances exist. Again, they're looking at blockchain to track, where things are coming from and also where they are selling to and such. Then we already talked about point of origin in terms of conflict minerals and raw materials and whether it has the right certifications in terms of organic foods and such. Then the last thing is tampering attempt, right? So this is in terms of, let's say you're transferring goods in a truck and the truck goes out of the GPS fence. Then immediately you can flag that, and that incident can be written to the blockchain. And now the insurance company, the manufacturer, the distributor, and anyone who needs to be involved, who needs to be notified, immediately has access to that immutable record of that incident happening, right? So these are some of the quick use cases that we are talking to customers about and the kind of use cases. There are more, but I just picked the top ones here for this slide.
I want to pause for a second, make sure, if anyone has a question at any time, feel free. So, okay.
Ken Pierhammer, Schneider Electric. A question I have is, given that blockchain requires, it's really an ecosystem play, at what point, and it costs money to be involved in a proof of concept and to devote time to it and have, partners around it. At what time does it make sense to actually jump in and begin to do these things? I can understand in the case of the pharmaceutical industry, you have perhaps an essential, urgent time frame coming on top of you. But for some of us who are going to participate in these supply chains, maybe at the edges of them, in many cases, maybe it's better for us to wait till we see if it becomes a standard and it's in use, because if it ultimately has, an understood standard and process to it, maybe jumping in later is better. How do you decide, when and how much of a level you participate?
I'll start by saying you have to decide based on what you can afford. But I can assure you, without regulations, we would still be moving forward at the pace that we are today, because we're in a position to help frame it. We're in a position to help leverage how it's going to be moved forward in our industry. And I think that's really important to us. There are options. We want to make sure we're at the table when those options are reviewed and decided upon. And so that's why we're working now. We are not typically a bleeding edge company when it comes to technology. We are a fast follower in most cases. This is an exception that we've made, irrespective of the regulations.
So it depends. I think each company will have to their decision. But what I see across industries, in certain industries like pharmaceutical or aerospace and defense or transportation and logistics, there are multiple companies already joining that ecosystem and start to build that standards together. So I think you'll have to see whether in your industry, whether there are enough companies that share the same mindset and pull this together as an ecosystem play. Yeah. And if you are early adopter, you can influence the standards and you can also influence business models of that system as well.
We have a question in the back left.
Yeah, it's again just another question on the track and trace, right? I get the part about the finality and the non-reputable part of the transaction once it's written to the fabric, the blockchain, right? Question that always bothers me in track and trace in supply chain operations, right, is let's say that you were tracking goods across the supply chain, let's say pharmaceuticals, for example. And one of the things you want to do is that, or maybe even better example is wine, something that closer to my heart. And you want to maintain this good at a particular temperature, pressure, humidity. Now that's a contract between the guy who's shipping the manufacturer and the end customer, the retailer, right? Now, once those conditions through IoT are written to the blockchain, everything is hunky-dory. You cannot tamper with it. But how do I ensure that there is no tampering in between? Because after all, I have to get that data through a gateway, right? Let's say from a truck. How do I know that that data is not being tampered with on the gateway? You see what I mean? I could be a malicious vendor, and I could say everything is within normal range, no matter what the sensors report from within the truck. On the gateway, I could write a little script saying that, yeah, everything is within normal ranges. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's a security aspect, and there are already well-known and well-understood security mechanisms to handle those things, and that applies even outside of this context too. If you look at all the IoT implementations and the cybersecurity implications of that, right? For example, some of the things that vendors do is that you can actually burn in the certificates into the chip of the IoT device itself, right? And then you're attaching signatures to your message, saying that, okay, you're digitally signing that message, and you're verifying those signatures. And it, like all security mechanisms, right? It's not just one thing. This is just one quick example. But you're right, that security mechanism needs to be addressed adequately, otherwise hacking could happen. And that's not necessarily a blockchain problem, but that's just a security problem in general.
Just to add to that, there are a lot of companies, whether they are pharmaceutical companies or food and agricultural companies, that are already using a lot of solutions to address that. It's the term they use is a cold chain. So it has to be refrigerated throughout the supply chain. So they already have a lot of IoT devices or sensors on the trucks or containers, and they are gathering that data, and they are managing that in a way. But now tying this data with blockchain, you are providing visibility into this data, not just to your company or logistics 3PLs, but across the supply chain. So if something, temperature drops on the container ship while it's shipping from Chile to Los Angeles, you can provide that data to retailers, like, for example, Costco or Walmart, and then you can negotiate. Instead of delivering this to Costco distribution center, you can reroute it to other areas so it can be processed and sold in different ways. So those kind of things we are discussing with many of our companies, but capturing that sensor data using IoT devices, that's already happening across multiple industries already. So what we are focusing on is tying that data with blockchain and giving visibility and traceability across the stakeholders in that end-to-end supply chain.
This is a good example, too, of where the chain code, as Anant described it, can have business rules in it and actually help with contract terms enforcement. Because for the cold chain problem that Stephen described, there's terms around the thresholds within which the goods have to be kept, and if it goes out, how long it can be out before it's got to be thrown away. So this is a good example of where blockchain, while the shipment's in process, can help with alerting that something's going wrong in combination with IoT. And secondly, if it went wrong and you have a record of that, then you can use the information on the blockchain in a trusted way to handle contract term issues.
I have another question for you. It seems to me that everybody on the panel here agrees that the technology is further along than many of us think. But part of what we're describing sort of takes me back to, the beginning of e-commerce, and we were going to build, e-marketplaces. We were going to build an electronic marketplace for transportation, for the chemical industry, and so forth and so on. And the trouble wasn't the technology. The trouble was getting enough participants to scale it. Are we in the same situation right now?
Yeah, you're right. Adoption of these new concepts is always it's a tricky thing because, right, it's not just about technology, it's about the processes and the outcomes and the culture of that industry vertical as well, right? I wrote about this actually sometime back on a blog called, Affordances in a Digital Transformation, right? As companies are trying to attempt this digital transformation and think about this digitalization, right? There are certain do's and don'ts in terms of organizational change and how you design your business processes and such, right? So it's as much a people and process as much as it is about technology, right? And so that's why it's important to take it in step by steps, even with blockchain adoption, right? Think big, but start small. Make sure to ensure success, and especially with blockchain because it exposes many different concepts, right? It takes time for people to wrap their heads around it. So make sure to get that social buy-in and show some quick wins, and then gradually take it from there.
You're right. This is, I think, a bigger challenge really than the technology.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways it's going to happen is if you look back and you look at the role Walmart played, for example, in the adoption of RFID technology, barcode technology. Prime movers are looking at this and they're seeing the business benefits, potential benefits of doing it. And what a lot of them are doing is that they start with a pilot, a use case that looks like it's going to provide a lot of value, and bring in a key supplier. They don't try to do the whole network at once, in other words. Mm-hmm. They start with themselves, if they're a prime mover in their industry. They bring in a key supplier, maybe a key customer, and try it and run some use cases. Once they've proved the value of it, you can start to bring other people in and expand that network. So you might have fewer participants at first than you really want to have eventually for it to make sense. But that's okay if you're trying to prove the value and build consensus on doing it this way.
Yeah.
Yep, I see that as well. Yeah, you need a quick win. Basically, the AmerisourceBergen and Merck did a proof of concept last year with SAP. So it was a 3-company POC. But when we showed this POC, there are a lot of other pharmaceutical companies who joined. So now we are doing the second POC. and there are 15 companies who joined. So those kind of sharing their ideas across industries will generate more adoption from other companies, and we start to see that in other industries like transportation and logistics, and aerospace and defense as well. So it's evolving, but it takes a lot of companies to work together and join the ecosystem.
Right.
Any other questions? I have a follow-up on this if there's no other questions. My follow-up question is this, right? In some ways, this is not a network, but it's kind of analogous to an industry kind of network solution. Can we have blockchain being used in one industry for one application that can then punch out to a different blockchain kind of network solution? Is that possible?
Yes, that's possible. So one area at the platform level, what we are talking a lot is blockchain to blockchain integration, so different blockchain technologies. Hyperledger is one we are using across 3 companies, but that's not the only blockchain technology. There are others, Ethereum, multi-chain, Quorum, and Ripple, and many others. But depending on the use case, sometimes there is, as you mentioned, that there is no single blockchain that dominates industry. So what we envision is there will be multiple blockchain-based solutions, but at the application level, it doesn't really matter. But at the blockchain fabric or foundation level, as long as we can develop standards and how we can share the data, then I think we will be able to operate across the different blockchain technologies. So that's one area we are focusing on, working across multiple blockchain technologies.
Even within an industry, you may end up with more than one network. You know, an aircraft manufacturer, their view of the world is their suppliers and their customers. But for one of their suppliers, they've got a different view of the world. They may want to have their own network, and they may want to interconnect those then.
Yep. Good.
Yeah, just like we don't have one database instance in an enterprise, right? Eventually, what could happen is, a company will be part of, many different networks, meant for different bespoke use cases.
Right.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, well, I'd like to give our panel a round of applause. I think they did an excellent job. Thank you, gentlemen, and I want to mention Jeff in particular. Jeff had some sort of business issue. You got in at 2 a.m. this morning, and
I had a blockchain meeting yesterday in Dallas.
and he still managed to make it here, so special kudos to Jeff. Well, again, thank you, and this sort of wraps up the ARC forum, and there's lunches out there, there's box lunches, and thanks to everybody for attending. Thank you.